All right, good evening. We have entered into the week on differential association and social learning theory, right? So this is the topic that we'll be discussing this week. If you ever get confused, right, about what we're going to be covering for the week, just go to the syllabus and go down and find the week that we're on, and it'll tell you what chapters or what readings you should read. It'll also tell you what assignment and when it's due, right? We do have an assignment this week. It's a quiz, and I'll make that quiz due on Sunday like I typically do. That'll be the typical schedule for weeks that we have a quiz, which will be most weeks, and I'll always make that due on Sunday at midnight. There might be some exceptions at the end of the semester, but typically it'll be due on Sunday at midnight. All right, so I do want to remind you of some of the concepts that we learned in structure and relevance of chronological theory, right? Because I want to apply those to each theory that we go through, right? So you'll remember articulated propositions, right? These are the things that the author lists, and boy, for differential association, it is really easy to find the propositions, articulated propositions, because he lists them 1 to 9, right? Now, not all theories are like that, right? And for collective advocacy and social disorganization, you kind of have to search around to figure out what are the main propositions, so the articulated propositions. So Southern makes this really easy, and I've provided, in addition to a PowerPoint for this chapter, I've also provided a handout, and it has on it Sutherland's 9 propositions of differential association, and then it also has Akers and Burgess's social learning theory, right? I think it was last week I said that in any typical week we're going to have the older version of the theory, and then we're going to have a new, updated, contemporary version, and that's what we're going to do this week, right? So Sutherland's differential association theory is the older, more traditional theory, and then the newer is Akers and Burgess. We'll talk about the difference between those, but I kind of want to go ahead and tell you what to expect, right, as you go through these readings. And again, you're going to find it really helpful if you read this before you listen to my lecture. All right. Edwin Sutherland, although he was not really much involved in social disorganization theory, he was at University of Chicago. Sorry, my battery's going dead, so I had to run find a cord, and hopefully this will keep it alive until we get to the end of this video. All right, sorry for the interruption. I was saying about Edwin Sutherland, he's also associated with the University of Chicago, so that gives you an idea that like a lot of the sociological theory, particularly prior to World War II, was coming out of University of Chicago, right? Sociological as well as criminological theory, right? So when we think about, I guess whenever I teach differential association and social learning, I always tell this story about when I was a kid, right? So it's story time, but this is highly relevant story, right? When I was young, I played baseball, right? And back then, we used to have a league after Little League called Dixie League, right? This league has either been renamed or doesn't exist anymore for obvious reasons, right? But it was called Dixie League back then, and I had a coach who was actually a prosecutor at that time. He was a lawyer. He lived in my neighborhood. I was friends with his kids and stuff, and he was our coach. And oftentimes he would be late, like there'd be some horrible crime. He had to go to the crime scene and stuff like that. And later in his career, he became a judge, right? But some of that's related, some of it's not so much, right? And I'm still in touch with this gentleman, and he's a family friend, right? But the important thing about that is he was often late, right? And this is very common among lawyers, just a tendency to run late, right? And when that happened, sometimes the boys on the baseball team would get into trouble. And one of these days, right, a kid came to practice and he had a number of different items. I think they were like cassette tapes, like, music, and probably some candy or something like that. And he had stole these items, right? And so he showed off all the stuff he stole, and he told us all how he did it and stuff. And over the next few weeks, other kids would go to the same store, TGNY, and they would steal stuff, right? And they would show it off, and everybody go, "Wow, that's something else," And so one person who probably learned it from an older brother or someone older in his neighborhood learned how to shoplifted, then taught other people how to shoplift. And he didn't just teach them how to do it, right? Like, I don't know, wear baggy clothes and distract someone that works there. And, this is way before video cameras and stuff like that. So it's fairly easy to shoplift back in those days. But also taught other kids that it was the cool thing to do, that it was, neat. You get away with it and under the noses of adults, and it was sneaky, and, you get stuff that without having to pay for it, and none of us really had any money, unless our parents gave us a little bit of money and stuff, right? And we could, if we did have money, we could save that money for something else, right? And so over time, more and more kids went over to the store and shoplifted stuff. Now, that story, right, describes exactly how differential association explains crime, right? In this case, shoplifting, but it could explain really any form of crime, right? And that leads me to the very first proposition in this list, right? And number one, criminal behavior is learned, right? It's learned. And it's not inherited, and some people argue that, like, the idea of you're born a criminal or something, or you inherit these, criminogenic genes from your father or your parents or your ancestors or something like that. Sutherland disagreed with all that. He said it is learned behavior, right? And then the second proposition, that it is criminal behavior is learned in interaction with other people in a process of communication. So when that older kid taught the rest of us how to shoplift, right, he did it with words, right? Through language and stuff like that, right? That's kind of obvious, right? This is one thing that I'll try to return to, is a lot of this is going to seem obvious, but I will talk about some other people that are arguing something totally different at the time, right? But let me finish before I return to that. The principal part of the learning of criminal behavior occurs within intimate personal groups. So we were all friends on that baseball team, right? We weren't listening to, some musician in California and learning how to shoplift, right? We weren't influenced by Ozzy Osbourne or what are some other musicians that supposedly have influenced juvenile delinquency. Gangster rap, Marilyn Manson, right? At various times, people have said, "Oh, this is why people get in trouble and engage in juvenile delinquency and stuff." And Sutherland's saying, "No, you're not." Here's one that people were saying back in Sutherland's time is it was thought by a lot of people that comic books, of all things, influence kids to commit juvenile delinquency. And they even had Senate hearings about the influence of comic books on juvenile delinquency. Sutherland would disagree with that. It's not, it's not through media. It's through close, intimate contact. In my example, a bunch of boys standing around in a circle, talking about what they did and, going ooh and ah and, that's so cool, man. I think I'm going to do that tomorrow and stuff like that, right? And so going on to our fourth proposition or articulated proposition, when criminal behavior is learned, learning includes techniques, how to commit the crime, right? Wear baggy clothes, get your buddy to distract the worker in the music department or something like that. Sometimes these techniques are simple, sometimes they're complicated, right? Shoplifting, pretty simple crime. Not, I guess there might be some varieties of it that are a little bit more complicated, right? Crimes are like this. Sometimes they're simple, sometimes they're hard. Here's one that's a little bit harder, right? But it also has to be taught, right? And that's making high-quality crystal meth, right? That's not easy, right? Or a number of drugs like this, LSD, or, and researchers, sociologists, criminologists have studied people that make meth, and you might watch some of these TV shows about this, and people are taught, right? Cooks, people who make meth are taught by other cooks, and they're even something that kind of looks like a apprentice. You serve some time under the instruction of someone that's much more experienced and is typically older, and they teach you all the things and all the risk and how to make a high quality potent product, right? And probably teach you how to sell and distribute that to your consumers or the drug users, right? Well, that's considerably more complicated. You can't learn that in a few sentences like shoplifting, right? And he talks about that, right? I don't know, other crimes are more complicated. I don't know, a lot of white collar crimes, considerably more complicated. Lots of fraud and more complicated. The point that Sutherland was making is like, sometimes it's simple, sometimes it's hard, right? People do teach other people the techniques, but they teach them other things as well, right? And some of those other things are the specific direction of motives, drives, rationalizations, and attitudes. When I said people on my baseball team had to teach the other kids that, like, oh, this is a cool thing to do, right? And I remember, I don't know, like 13 and being kind of naive and innocent, and I didn't really think that was a cool thing to do. That was like the type of thing that if I did, my dad was going to beat my ass really bad, right? And that probably explains, maybe why I didn't do it. But everyone else did, right? Well, most everyone else did. More than half of the baseball team eventually went over there and stole something from the store, right? My dad was a shop owner too, and that might explain why I didn't too. Because my entire life, I'd heard Dad talk about how much he hated shoplifters. I probably felt like he'd keep me out of the house if I got caught shoplifting. It wasn't necessarily because I was a good kid or anything like that. I got in other trouble later in my life, but at that moment, I guess I was still pretty innocent and naive, and maybe it even described me as good at that point, right? So people have to be taught that here's something, maybe up to this point, everyone's been teaching you don't do that, right? But now we're going to redefine that behavior and tell you it's something worthwhile or, cool or some other whatever slang young people use nowadays, right? And one other thing that juveniles teach each other about the commission of crime and delinquency is they teach each other rationalizations, how to commit a delinquent act, but believe that you're still a good person, right? And if you've ever known people that shoplift, you've probably heard some of these things, right? I mean, I imagine we all know people who have shoplifted before, right? But I've known people, and it's like lots of people steal from Walmart, right? Not a good place to shoplift from because, cameras everywhere, right? And but if someone does steal from a really large, like big box or something like that, they will often attempt to explain that way, like rationalize it by saying, oh, it's Walmart. Walmart is a billion-dollar corporation. They're not going to notice if I, eat a few grapes as I'm going through the produce department or something like that, or steal some candy, or maybe I don't scan every one of my items when I go through the self-checkout, or, what do they expect me to scan every item? Like, they never trained me for this job. I'm not an employee of Walmart, right? So those are ways to kind of rationalize. So to engage in delinquent behavior, not think of yourself, to engage in criminal behavior, not think of yourself as a criminal. Those things are also taught in addition to the techniques, the how to commit crime, right? And those things are important. In fact, there's a whole nother theory called techniques of neutralization that just focuses upon those rationalizations, right? And if you're following along in this list of propositions, of articulated propositions by Sutherland, you'll see that rationalizations is mentioned toward the end of Proposition 4, right? So let's keep going, right? We also teach delinquents and criminals teach each other attitudes, right? These beliefs that either encourage or discourage crime, right? This next thing, the specific directions of motives and drives is learned from definitions of legal codes as favorable or unfavorable. And a person becomes delinquent because an excess of definitions favorable to violation of law over definitions unfavorable to violation of law. Essentially what that means is like all of us at different times in our lives are taught we should obey the law. Those are definitions of the law that are unfavorable to violation. And then at other times we're taught by other delinquents and criminals that we should violate the law, right? And it's a ratio, right? And so, as my friends in that baseball team are hearing other people, and maybe like me, have all these beliefs and attitudes and stuff like that for my parents, like you don't steal stuff and definitely don't shoplift and stuff like that, right? And those other kids were probably taught those things. But as they learned about these, the opposite of those, the definitions favorable to violation of law, it kind of, it's kind of like a scale, right? And the scale starts tipping like this, and they decide to commit crime. Prior to that interaction, they were probably like this, right? So we all have this mixture of beliefs, attitudes, norms, values, and it's constantly in flux, right? I could, even at my ripe old age, I could fall in with a tough crowd, right? And maybe hit it off with some new friends or something like that. And it could tip those scales, right? And this is kind of the insight of differential association, that for most people, you're going to behave like those. You're going to think, feel, and act like the people that you hang out with the most, right? Yeah, it's real important for college students to think about this, right? If you hang out with a bunch of other kids that, drink to excess, use drugs, I don't know, cheat, lie. Even if you're not that type of person, most people, if they're around that for long enough, they will start acting that way. Not everyone, we can think of exceptions, but right? And this is, parents recognize this, and my parents would try to prevent me from hanging out with the bad influences, right? So there's some kids, in my neighborhood, if we got in trouble and stuff, like, oh, no more hanging out with Hank, right? Every time you hang out with Hank, y'all get in trouble and stuff, right? And parents realize this, right? There's even sayings, you'll be like those you hang out with, right? A lot of truth to that. A lot of truth to that. We might can think of some exceptions, but as a general rule, that's true. And that's kind of what Edwin Sutherland is pointing out, right? The next proposition, differential association, may vary in frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. If you encounter more friends that are juvenile delinquents, all other things equal, you'll probably be more likely to engage in delinquent behavior, right? If you hang out for them with long periods of time rather than, short in duration, more likely to engage in delinquency, right? If the one about priority, if your best friends going way back, right? Back in history and time, they're the first ones, right? Or your parents, or a brother, or cousins or something like that, to people that we often know all the way well into childhood and maybe can't even remember the first time that we met them, right? If your older brothers and sisters are delinquents, good chance that you'll kind of follow in their footsteps, right? So that's priority. And the last thing is intensity, right? And I don't know if you've ever noticed this before, but I noticed it when I was young, that certain people, right? Like, have you ever heard the story of Bonnie and Clyde, right? These bank robbers and murderers. And it's like a true story, but it kind of looms large in American mythology and stuff like that. This is the idea of intensity, that certain people, when they get together, right? Oh man, they'll commit more crime than they ever would by themselves. And that happens. Sometimes you see two people get together and it's just, it's like a chemical reaction or something like that. And they do things that they otherwise would never do, right? That's the idea of intensity, right? And and friends can be like that. Lovers can be like that. If you ever watch the movie Natural Born Killers, you get a sense of that. That is essentially like a modern retelling of Bonnie and Clyde, that movie. That's the idea of intensity, right? The next proposition, number 8, the process of learning criminal behavior by association with criminal and anti-criminal patterns involves all the mechanisms that are involved in any other learning. So it's like you learn through all the same mechanisms to engage in conformist, law-abiding behavior, and it's all the same mechanisms that you learn how to commit crimes. It's no different, right? It's just different form of behavior, but it's all learned behavior, right? And this one is important as we kind of move into the next one, social learning, right? Well, the big differences between Sutherland's theory and Akers and Burgess is that Akers and Burgess have a much greater knowledge of learning theories, which really come from the discipline of psychology and not sociology. Sutherland was not an expert on learning, right? But he put in this eighth proposition basically saying that I don't know how learning happens, but learning delinquent and criminal behavior is bound to happen the same way any other learning. And I will let other people figure out the learning process and the dynamics of learning, right? And that's exactly what Akers and Burgess do, right? And I'll return to that in a second, right? Number 9, last proposition. We're getting close, right? While criminal behavior is an expression of general needs and values, it is not explained by those needs and values, right? Since non-criminal behavior is an expression of the same needs and values. All right, this proposition is arguing against some other theorists that we have not really talked about yet, right? Some people were arguing things like everyone wants status, right? Everyone wants the esteem of their peers. Everyone wants to be admired or wants power or something like that, right? And some of these people were saying, oh, people commit acts of juvenile delinquency because they want to kind of move up in that pecking order. They want other people to think they're cool or whatever like that, right? And they want to move up that. And that, that can be important to juveniles. Certainly can be important to juveniles. But what Sutherland is saying is that, having status, that explains criminal and non-criminal behavior, right? That desire for status, right? Some people want status and they want to, move up the pecking order. And the way that they do that is they go to school and they study real hard and they get in college and eventually, they enter into a profession and everyone respects them in their community, right? And what he's saying in that ninth proposition is like, it can't be the cause of criminal behavior in conformist behavior, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? The exact same thing, status seeking, cannot be the cause of criminal inconformist behavior. That's what he's saying in the ninth. All right. I've already talked a little bit about Akers and Burgess, right? And essentially what they do, and if you look at this PowerPoint, I have the 9 propositions of, and you probably can't see this, but bring it up on your computer or print it out or something. And then eventually it gets to Akers and Burgess's social learning theory, and they basically just reformulate, they rewrite all of the other propositions. They combine some, so it's not 9, it's 7, right? And they incorporate what I talked about earlier is learning theory. This learning theory that comes from psychology, right? I know some of y'all have probably taken psychology and some of y'all have probably not, right? But if you've taken psychology and you learned about Pavlov's dog, if you learned about operant conditioning, if you learned about B.F. Skinner, right? If you learned about the Bobo doll experiment in social learning, right? Now aggression is taught in this Bobo doll experiment, right? Where people take this doll, a certain type of doll, they call it Bobo doll. It's like kind of like a punching bag. You punch it and it kind of bounces back up and stuff. I mean, yeah, we had them when I was a kid. I don't know that they're that common anymore. And what they would do in the Bobo doll is experiment is they would have an adult act aggressive toward that doll, hit it, take an object, I think a hammer, hit it, and stuff like that. And they would have young kids watch this. And then the young kids would learn that behavior from the adult, and they would do it to the Bobo doll, right? And it's, it's the experiment shows that aggressive behavior can be learned, it can be modeled, it can be taught from one person to another, right? And so they take that idea, right? All of that psychological learning theory, and they combine it with Edwin Sutherland's ideas from differential association, and then they have a new theory, or kind of a one that combined. It took a couple of theories and combined them and came up with a new theory, right? And that's Akers and Burgess's social learning theory. Now, I'm not going to go through all these because I've already taught 30 minutes, right? But I'm going to let you go through all these and see how they relate to Sutherland's and look and notice the changes that exist, right? I'm not going to read those to you, right? In the sake of brevity, right? I'm going to try to keep these videos short as possible, right? All right, I do want to point out a number of things about differential association in social learning theory. First thing is, for the longest time, this was the most popular criminological theory. And it continues to be quite popular, right? And before this theory, there were other theories. Even before social disorganization, there were other theories. And most of those other theories were kind of biological in nature. And they said this: certain people, types of people, certain families are criminal, and their kids inherit that from them, right? And they, and the other thing they would argue is like certain races are criminal, and their kids of those races inherit those, genes or whatever we would call them now, but they inherit those characteristics, right? Edwin Sutherland is, he pretty much ended all that. I mean, there's still some kind of nut jobs that argue these kind of things and stuff, like white supremacists and stuff like that, but there's no serious criminologist anymore that thinks that criminal behavior is inherited, right? So remember when I said the first proposition was criminal behavior is learned? And I said, you might think this is obvious. You might, like, criminal behavior is learned. Duh. Like, well, let me point out that there were people prior to this in the early, 1900s, right? And some of them continued in the 40s, 50s, 60s that were arguing something that was a complete opposite of criminal behavior is learned. And that's, they were arguing that was inherited, right? And for the most part, Sutherland wins that debate, right? And this is something that's really common in sociology, right? And this is a sociological theory. Sutherland was a sociologist, right? And in sociology, we don't like biological theory, right? We don't think it explains that much, maybe a little bit, but, and we really hate racist theory, right? And me included, right? So, I don't think anyone really inherits characteristics that make them criminals or anything like that, right? There's lots of other reasons why, right? But I don't think they inherit it, right? Now, even if you find out that, like, oh, if your parents are criminals, you might be more likely to be a criminal, right? That is true, right? But that doesn't mean you inherit it. That might mean your parents taught you, right? Or your brothers and sisters taught you, right? And that they teach you, that's completely consistent with Sutherland's theory, right? So that first thing, like criminal behavior is learned, that the reason why that is not like duh and that obvious is because at the time people were arguing something totally different. And that's that criminal behavior was inherited and certain races have more, right? And I don't know if you know the whole ugly history of eugenics and stuff like that, right? So I wanted to point that out, right? I wanted to point out a few other things. And as you listen to this video, you should kind of be going through these PowerPoints as well, right? So read the chapter, listen to the lecture, go through the PowerPoints, right? If you understand everything and see how it all fits together, then you'll really know the theory, right? Hey, big boy. You want to come say hello?
I said hello in the last one.
I know, this is a different group of students than the last video.
How much students do you have every day?
I don't know. I don't know how many people are in this class. Probably like 30, something around there. Yeah, I have one class, homicide, that's got like 43 or something like that.
My class has 20 people.
Yeah, I have some classes that are about 20. Yeah. Well, you want to let me finish up, buddy?
Yeah.
All right. That's my son, Trayson, right? He has to come see what's going on and who I'm talking to. All right. I want to talk a little bit about the policy recommendations of this, right? Which was another one of those concepts that was brought up in the structure and relevance structure and relevance article that I assigned you, right? So if you believe that Sutherland and Akers were right, and this is, the best way to explain crime, like, what should we do? If this is a good theory and it explains things well, what should we do to reduce, and if we do it, will it reduce crime, right? And so this theory actually provides some important policy implications and can tell us a number of things that if we do it, it should reduce criminal behavior in the individual, right? And parents will do some of those things, like I talked about, like keep your kids away from bad influences and stuff like that, right? But there are other people that these policy recommendations are important to. If you're a juvenile court judge, a family court judge, right, and you hear cases of a juvenile delinquency because they're not in criminal court, right? Almost usually that's true, true unless someone's tried as an adult. And then if you know about differential association and you're a judge, then what should you do? Well, the first thing you're going to do, and most judges will do this, is say, whoever you got in trouble with, you're not to hang out with them ever again. If we catch you hanging out with them in the same car, at a house, or anything like that, we'll violate your probation. We'll pick you up and we'll bring you back to juvie, right? And they'll tell your mom and dad too, right? Don't let them hang out with any of these bad influences, particularly the ones that he got arrested with that day, right? And they'll tell you, in your probation officers, like, you can't hang out with those people. You also can't hang out with any other known juvenile delinquents. If you're in the presence of other people and they start engaging in acts of juvenile delinquency, like drinking, smoking weed, shoplifting, anything like that, you better get your ass out of there, because it'll violate your probation even if you don't do it and you're just in the presence of them. We will violate your terms of your probation. You'll go back to juvie, right? And we do that with adult criminals as well, right? When you're on probation or parole, you can't hang out with other felons. You're not even supposed to be in there around them at all, right? You're not supposed to have communication with them if you're on probation or parole, typically, right? And so those are things. And then here's another policy implication: if you learn to be a criminal, then you can unlearn to be a criminal, right? And lots of attempts at treating juvenile delinquency or criminal behavior focuses upon this, right? You have to unlearn these things and learn to be a law-abiding citizen, right? And that's if you can learn this, then you can learn that, right? And that's shown, those programs show a lot of promise. They do a lot of good. They do reform people and rehabilitate people, right? Other policy implications. Well, here's some other ones, right? The way that we punish people, right, in the United States. We typically, the most common form of punishment for criminals is to put them in prison, right? Prisons have the potential to make criminals worse, not better, right? And differential association can explain this, right? Prisons can be schools for criminal behavior, right? Because a person, particularly if he's not a serious offender, or if he's a young offender and he's just starting to engage in criminal behavior, if you put him in an adult prison where almost everyone in that prison is going to be a more hardened, seasoned criminal, they're going to be older, they're going to know things that the younger fellow won't, well, they're going to teach him, right, all the techniques of crimes, many of those crimes he does not know of, right? Yeah. And so that's a big important policy implication of differential association, right? Has some other, similar policy implications for things like drug treatment centers, for example, right? I grew up in the 80s, and, the 1980s were an unbelievable time to grow up, right? And it was at the height of the war against drugs. And it was very common for people to send their kids away to drug treatment centers for long periods of time, quite often, if they were smoking marijuana or something like that, nowadays most parents probably wouldn't do that, right? And we criminologists and substance abuse researchers have done a lot of research on this. If you take someone that's just a marijuana smoker and you send them to drug rehab, they're going to find out about a whole lot of other drugs, how to use them, where to buy them, right? They're going to make connections. They're going to be told what neighborhoods. They're going to even maybe be given phone numbers. Call this person when you get out and they'll hook you up and stuff, right? And for those people, the kind of beginner, not real serious drug users, right, just smoking marijuana and maybe drinking beer and stuff like that, as a result of going to drug treatment center, their drug-taking behavior might increase rather than decrease. You see how that's really similar to, like, by going to prison, you didn't stop committing crimes, but you came out and you committed a lot more of them, right? Differential association tells us that that's a possibility, right? That's a real possibility. We should guard against that. And it also tells you, like, when we run a prison, segregate people. And maybe when you run a treatment center too, it's like, don't put the marijuana smokers in with fentanyl injection users and stuff like that. Don't put the young people in with the old people. Don't put property criminals in a prison with like people there for rape and violence and more serious crimes, right? And if you don't take our advice and put them all together and stuff, here's what you should expect, right? That a lot of times those less serious offenders won't get better, but they'll actually get worse. And differential association can explain that. All right. Those are pretty important policy recommendations, right? And I don't know, like some of y'all maybe have your eye on a job or a career in law enforcement, probation officer. Maybe some of y'all even work in a drug treatment center later in your life. And you should know about that potential, right? And even if you're not going to work in those, and maybe you'll have kids one day, and you might find a bag of marijuana or something like that. Don't freak out like people often did in the 80s and send your kid away for a year in some drug treatment center in Florida or something like that, right? If it might, if he's a real serious, if you find other stuff besides marijuana and needles and fentanyl and meth and stuff like that, that might be a good idea. But if he's like experimenting with certain substances and stuff like that, you could very well make him worse, right? Or her worse, or whatever type of kid you're going to have, right? And that's valuable information, because if you're a parent, you love your kid, I hope. I'm assuming you'll love your kid, and you don't want to spend thousands of dollars and they come out a worse drug user, right? They're supposed to get treated. They're supposed to get better, healthier, and stuff like that, right? So, I like this theory. I think it's really useful, right? It has all sorts of applications. It explains a lot about delinquent behavior as well as adult behavior. And one thing I want to point out, that a lot of these stories, a lot of these theories start as theories of juvenile delinquency. That was true of social disorganization. But after a while, people are like, you know what? It works pretty good for adults too. And differential associations like that. It starts off a theory of juvenile delinquency, but it works pretty good for adults too. So it just becomes a more general theory of crime. All right. I'll stop. Y'all have a nice day. Thanks for listening to me. I hope I didn't bore you too much, and I hope you see the brilliance and genius of this theory. And I hope you understood it as I kind of explained it in maybe a slightly dumbed down version and simpler version for video, right? Y'all have a nice day.